In 1990, the members of the New England Congregational Church in Aurora, Illinois, created an endowment fund within the Community Foundation of the Fox River Valley to provide income for the future needs of the church. 1990 was a significant year for the establishment of the fund, since the current church building was constructed exactly 100 years earlier in 1890. The Community Foundation is proud to produce this video in honor of New England Congregational Church and its commitment to build a permanent charitable resource within our organization. In 2007, Reverend Gary L. McCann published the story of New England Congregational Church, a church he has led as senior minister since 1988. He titled his book, "Through These Doors," a name that appropriately reflects the thousands who have entered the church to worship and give thanks. We are grateful to Reverend McCann for sharing his research for the production of this video. The traditions of New England Congregational Church can be traced back to the Pilgrims and the Puritans. These needlepoint cushions are but two of the more than 40 cushions designed and crafted by members of the church to illustrate biblical stories, the church's Christian heritage, and the traditions of other faiths. In the early 1600s, when the Pilgrims faced persecution for their efforts to reform the Church of England, they set sail for the New World, establishing the Plymouth Colony in 1620. 8 years later, in 1628, the Puritans arrived in the New World and established the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the area of present-day Salem, Massachusetts. These ancestors of the church built simple meeting houses that served as places of worship and as places to conduct secular meetings. Each congregation was responsible for the activities and the governance of their members' spiritual lives. This is the origin of the use of the word congregational in relation to a church structure where the congregation controls its destiny. In 1801, a plan was developed to join the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists in the Midwestern part of the country to ensure the opportunity for worship in the sparsely populated areas. However, by 1852, they went their separate ways over the issue of slavery. At that time, the Presbyterians were more moderate in their outlook on slavery than the activist Congregationalists. The issue that divided the nation divided the two religions. It was the Congregationalists who constructed the first church building in Aurora, Illinois. Records are unclear as to the exact date, but 1838 is the year favored by most sources. The members called their church the First Congregational Church. It was located on West Park Place, immediately west of the current McCarty Park. Incredible history was made within the walls of that first church. It hosted a debate between United States Senator Stephen Douglas and abolitionist Frederick Douglass. The church also had the distinction of being called the Union Depot because it served as a stop on the Underground Railroad for slaves fleeing from the South. And in 1854, the People's Convention was established at the church, which called for a new political party with an anti-slavery platform. That party was called the Republican Party. To this day, debate continues as to where the Republican Party was actually formed. Was it Ripon, Wisconsin, Jackson, Michigan, or the First Congregational Church in Aurora, Illinois? Most historians give the nod to Ripon, Wisconsin. By 1856, the congregation had outgrown its original church. They then built a magnificent new structure on the corner of Main Street, now called Galena Boulevard, and East Park Place. This stately edifice, which was located 1 block away from the original church building, served its members for over 100 years. In 1968, the structure was destroyed by fire. However, the congregation was no longer meeting in the church, as they had moved to a smaller building in Montgomery, Illinois, in the mid-1960s. Later, the church members voted to disband. Thus, the First Congregational Church in Aurora no longer exists. As an aside, the First Congregational Church sold its original building to the Union Baptists in 1860. Then the Baptists sold it to a businessman in 1879 to make room for the Park Place Baptist Church, which the congregation was building on the original site. The new owner moved Aurora's first church to Water Street in downtown Aurora, where it eventually became a warehouse. It was demolished in 1934. The story of New England Congregational Church began in 1858, 2 years after the First Congregational Church built its impressive new house of worship. 31 members of First Congregational decided to create their own church on the west side of Aurora, where many of them lived. They first met at the Second Methodist Episcopal Church on the north side of Galena Boulevard, between Lake and River Street. Although the 1908 written history of New England Church placed this Methodist church on Lake Street, historical records clearly show that no building existed at that location. The church's records indicate that members then began meeting on the second floor of the Phillips Brothers and Company grocery store, which was located at 19 South River Street, between Galena Boulevard and Downer Place. They named their church the New England Congregational Church. The members built a culture of inclusiveness. Not only did they stand fast for anti-slavery efforts, they also were early advocates of a woman's right to assume leadership roles within the church, including the right to vote. It took the country 62 years to follow the lead of the Congregational Church. On January 1, 1859, Reverend George B. Hubbard received the call to become the church's first minister. Hubbard, who was born in New Haven, Connecticut, received his undergraduate degree and his degree in theology from Yale College. He was a descendant of William Hubbard, an Englishman who immigrated to the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. Under Hubbard's guidance, New England Church constructed its first building in 1860 on the west side of Locust Street, between Galena Boulevard and Downer Place. After considerable financial sacrifice by church families, the building carried no debt at the time of its dedication. The total cost of the new structure was $1,264.44. In March 1861, 2 years before the Emancipation Proclamation, the church drafted a document in support of the abolitionist movement. Church members were firm in their resolve. "We, as Christian men and women, most solemnly protest in the name of our holy religion against any compromise or concession that shall add to our responsibility for, or complicity with, the stupendous wrong of American slavery." Reverend Hubbard took a leave of absence in November 1864 to minister to the troops in the South during the Civil War. 10 young men from the church had enlisted in the war, and 2 did not return. The following year, Hubbard resigned as pastor of the church he had led for nearly 7 years. As minister, he advanced the church's stance on the volatile issues of the day through his writings in the Aurora Beacon News. As this needlepoint cushion indicates, Reverend G. B. Hubbard took care of the little group until 1865. After the loss of their minister, the congregation was discouraged and voted to disband. Then a miracle occurred when the Sunday school children sang in a concert on a Sunday afternoon. A wealthy member of the First Congregational Church, who was in the audience, was so touched that he pledged to support New England Church at the level he was contributing to his own church. That gesture encouraged New England Church members to withdraw their vote to disband. It was the children who kept the dream alive. The Reverend Edward Ebbs became the second minister of the church. Ebbs was born in England and immigrated to Canada with his family when he was a teenager. He was a graduate of the Theological Institute in Toronto, Canada. During his brief time in Aurora, Ebbs oversaw the addition of 77 members, the purchase of a reed organ, and the creation of a church choir. This photo of the first Congregational church choir was taken a few years before the New England choir was formed, and reflects the formal dress of the day. In November 1868, Thomas Nelson Haskell, a professor from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, accepted the church's call to become its third minister. Haskell was born in New York and was a graduate of the Union Theological Seminary in New York. During his ministry at New England Church, 64 members were added to the church rolls. A pipe organ was purchased, and gas lamps replaced the kerosene chandeliers in the sanctuary. In 1869, Reverend Haskell joined the committee that oversaw the construction of the first YMCA building in Illinois, which was built on Fox Street, now called Downer Place, across from the old City Hall in Aurora. The facility was to become a Christian reading room, to guard young men from the evil influences that surrounded them. Haskell resigned from the church in 1871 and moved to Colorado. A few years later, he helped to found Colorado College. Haskell House at the college was named in his honor. The fourth minister, Reverend Dexter D. Hill, came to New England Church in 1872, where he remained its leader for 8 years. Hill was born in Massachusetts and was a descendant of Christopher Avery. Avery came to America with John Winthrop, one of the leading figures in the founding of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in 1630. While a student at Beloit College in Wisconsin, Reverend Hill served in the Wisconsin Cavalry during the Civil War. His war letters have been archived and can be read on the Beloit College website. During his ministry, it was discovered that the church had no legal existence in Kane County. Under Reverend Hill's guidance, a constitution was written, and the proper papers were filed. The church now was officially recognized in the eyes of the county. In 1876, Hill's wife, Louise, and her friend, Hannah Delatour, launched the Women's West Side Reading Circle in Aurora. Delatour had just read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad and remarked to Mrs. Hill that she was looking for someone with whom to share the book's humor. Thus began the formation of a literary book club which exists in Aurora to this day. In 1880, Reverend Hill resigned as minister of New England Church to take a position at Beloit College. The church was then without a minister for 1 year. However, Professor Cody of Jennings Seminary in Aurora served as the interim minister. This highly regarded school, which was located on LaSalle Street, closed in the early 1940s. Then, in 1881, the church called its fifth pastor, Reverend William Windsor. Windsor was born in England in 1830 and immigrated to the United States when he was 14 years old. While he was minister, a furnace replaced the heating stoves in the church, and new carpeting was installed. In those days, flyers were used to announce services and meetings. Sunday school, called Sabbath School, was held at noon on Sundays, and prayer meetings were held each Thursday evening. Everyone was invited to attend regularly, punctually, and devoutly. In return, they would find a blessing. The Sunday school was having financial trouble during this time. In response, George Hurd, a noted Zouave leader and member of New England, coached 17 young women from the church who decided to form a Broom drill club. Their goal was to march into the public with brooms and dustpans to sweep up needed coins. Their efforts met with success. Several years later, Hurd organized the world-famous Aurora Zouaves, whose precision in military drills took them throughout the world. In 1887, church members began discussions regarding the construction of a new church building. The following year, Reverend Windsor resigned due to personal health issues. The church then called its sixth pastor, the Reverend John O. Harvick, in 1888. Harvick was born in Norway in either 1857 or 1858. Historical records disagree as to the year of his birth as well as his death. Harvick was a graduate of the Chicago Theological Seminary. During his term, the church began the task of raising money for a new church building. By January 1889, the committee to solicit subscriptions had raised $10,755. The new church was to be located on Chestnut Street and Galena Boulevard, which was 1 block away from the original church. The original church was sold to the Advent Christian Church, which, a year or two later, sold the building to Holy Angels Catholic Church. On May 4, 1890, the 32-year-old congregation proudly held services for the first time in its new sanctuary. The curved pews and sloped floors provided good views of the chancel for all congregants. These pews are still used in the church today. The intricately carved pulpit, lectern, and communion table were stunning. The pulpit furniture has since been placed in the church's Johnson Chapel. The sanctuary, which could seat 420 people, also housed a Hook and Hastings Tracker organ. The organist faced the beautiful stenciled pipes, and a curtain was placed between the musicians and the congregation. 2 large stained glass windows were installed on the east and west walls of the sanctuary. The artist who crafted the windows and the company that manufactured them are unknown. The east side of the building's exterior remains today as it did in 1890, except that the porch has been enclosed. There were 2 entrances at that time, as evidenced by this 1930s photo. The tower alcove entrance is still used today, and although there is room for a bell in the tower, records do not reveal that one has ever been installed there. The total expense to build the church, with all of its furnishings, was $30,000. In November 1892, Reverend Harvick submitted his resignation to continue his ministry on the East Coast. In July 1893, Reverend Dr. Julian M. Sturtevant, Jr. became pastor. He was born in Illinois. His father, Julian M. Sturtevant, Sr., was the president of Illinois College in Jacksonville. Reverend Sturtevant was an 1854 graduate of that college. During Sturtevant's ministry at New England, benevolence contributions were raised significantly to nearly $3,000 per year. In addition, the Sunday school became an official part of the church and was supervised by Mrs. A.V. Greenman, wife of the superintendent of the West Aurora schools. Prior to this time, it was a separate entity sponsored by the church. Also during those years, the rental of pews to the congregation helped to underwrite the budget. 2-sided postcards were mailed to the members, who could then reserve their seats for the coming year. Reverend Sturtevant resigned in 1897 after a serious illness. Reverend John T. Blanchard became pastor later that year. He was born in Michigan in 1852 and was a student at Olivet College in that state. Reverend Blanchard and his wife Carrie had 4 children. Two of their children, Howard and Bertha, are pictured here with the couple. More than 70 new members joined the church after attending Blanchard's special meetings that included an evangelist and a singer. The church flourished during his 4 years of service. Reverend William Buss became the 9th pastor of the church in 1901. Buss was born in England. He attended Wheaton College in Illinois and was a graduate of the Chicago Theological Seminary. In addition to being a minister, he was an accomplished poet and essayist. He won the contest to write a poem for Nebraska's semi-centennial. His work was entitled Hymn to Nebraska. He also published a book of sonnets and poems. While at New England Church, Reverend Buss was successful in attracting younger members to the church. Of the 65 new members who joined during his tenure, the majority were under 25 years of age. He resigned from the church in 1905 to return to Nebraska, where he had been a pastor prior to coming to Aurora. In 1906, Reverend Wallace W. Willard became pastor of the church. Willard was born in Massachusetts in 1862. While at New England, Willard oversaw the construction of a dining room and kitchen on the 3rd floor of the church, where the current chapel and restrooms are located. In addition, a system for collecting weekly offerings for operating expenses and mission benevolence replaced the old system of pew rental. Also of interest was the tradition of holding the church's annual meetings on either New Year's Eve or New Year's Day. This practice was later discontinued due to low attendance. Reverend Willard was minister during the church's 50th anniversary celebration in 1908. In that year, Miss Margaret Town, who was a charter member of the New England Church, recorded the church's first history. In 1910, church member and Sunday school teacher Charles H. Norton organized Boy Scout Troop No. 3 at the church. The troop, one of the oldest continuously chartered Boy Scout troops in the nation, remains a vibrant organization sponsored by the church to this day. In 1912, Reverend Ellison Ray Heaps was hired to replace Reverend Willard. Heaps was born in Illinois and was a 1904 graduate of Northwestern University. While at New England Church, he was successful in growing the membership. By 1915, there were 428 members. 87 new members were received in that year alone. The church was continuing its outreach in new ways. Reverend Heaps helped the congregation send resolutions to Congress in support of national prohibition. Locally, the church hosted West Aurora High School's annual commencements during this time. The high school was located on Blackhawk Street, 1 block away from the church. In 1918, Reverend Heaps resigned, and a young 31-year-old minister, Reverend Harold Parr, took over the reins. Parr was born in Birmingham, England, in 1887. He came to America in 1908 and studied at the University of Chicago. He received his degree in theology at the Theological Seminary in Chicago. His ministry lasted only a few short months when he died of the wartime influenza that had killed so many throughout the world. His memorial service was held at the church on December 1st, 1918. An article in the Beacon News expressed this sentiment: "To a home in England where lives a loving family, Aurora must send the sad news of a young man's death, as so many similar messages have come across the seas to American homes in recent months." The tragedies of World War I took a toll on families throughout the world. After his sad and untimely death, the grieving church approved a motion that pastors were not to be allowed to stand in the vestibule during cold weather, as the congregation had thought this was the reason for Parr's death. Reverend Edward J. Webster became the 13th minister of the church in 1919. He was born in Vermont and was a graduate of Yale College. During his tenure at New England, the congregation purchased the Gary House, which stood directly to the west of the church. It became known as the Church House and was used for the expanding Sunday school. The Boy Scout troop flourished as well. Webster resigned in 1922 and eventually entered the field of teaching. He is pictured here as the chairman of the Department of Economics at the American International College in Springfield, Massachusetts. In 1923, Reverend Bertram Hanscom accepted the call to be the church's 14th minister. Hanscom was born in Maine. He oversaw significant remodeling projects for the church. The basement was excavated for a new room for the Boy Scouts, and a safer electrical wiring system was installed throughout the building. Hanscom served the church until 1928. In appreciation of his willingness to guide them through difficult times, the congregation presented him with a new Dodge sedan. He is pictured here in the late 1960s. Later that year, Reverend Charles M. Hauser received the call to serve as minister. Hauser was born in Pennsylvania and was educated at Harvard College and the Chicago Theological Seminary. Under his leadership, the church began placing advertisements in the Beacon News. New England Church was the first church in Aurora to undertake this public relations effort. In addition, the church's first newsletter, Tidings, was published in 1929 and mailed to church members each Friday for an annual subscription of 25 cents. The Tidings continues to this day. Also, Reverend Hauser established the Sunday Evening Club, which provided outstanding music and lecture programs. This new initiative demonstrated the church's sincere desire to provide its members and the community at large with spiritual, educational, and cultural opportunities. Hauser resigned as pastor in 1930. In 1931, Reverend William E. McCormack became the church's 16th pastor. McCormack was born in Farmington, Missouri in 1904 and was a graduate of Southwest Missouri State College. He received his Bachelor of Divinity degree from Garrett Biblical Institute. During his tenure at New England Church, attendance was increasing due to the Great Depression, but he faced financial challenges. He guided a major renovation of the church in 1934. The chancel was renovated in the Gothic architectural style, and a Tiffany rose window was added over the altar. The choir was seated in a formal English cathedral style, with pews facing one another. And the carvings on the altar, pulpit, lectern, and panels were done by the celebrated artist Alois Lang from Oberammergau, Germany. The total cost of the renovation was $25,000. It truly was a miracle that the church was successful in accomplishing these renovations during such difficult times. Throughout the church's history, it was the women who were unwavering in their commitment to raising needed financial support. The Ladies' Union worked tirelessly to ensure the future of the church. They raised money for renovations and for operating expenses when funds were short. Reverend McCormack resigned in 1940 to become the minister of the First Congregational Church in Springfield, Massachusetts. The 300-year-old church was referred to as the Old First Church. The next minister to serve New England Church was the Reverend G. Paul Stowell. Stowell was born in Iowa in 1896. He received his undergraduate degree from Oberlin College and his degree in theology from the Chicago Theological Seminary. During his years at New England, the youth ministries were growing to the point that an assistant minister for religious education was needed. In 1947, a building campaign was launched to construct an addition for the church offices, Sunday school rooms, and a fellowship hall. The addition to the church covered up the west side of the original church building, as shown in this photo. The $220,000 cost of the construction project was fully paid by 1951. Reverend Stoll also oversaw the 1948 formation of the New England Nursery School, which continues to serve the Aurora community to this day. It now is called the New England Church Preschool, to reflect the current nomenclature for such schools. During the ensuing years, the youth attendance increased dramatically, and the music programs expanded. Eventually, there were 3 youth choirs, a junior choir, junior high choir, and high school choir. The chancel choir, well known for its professional quality, was comprised of many business and civic leaders in the Aurora community. In 1953, the organ was replaced with a Cassavant organ for $28,750. 61 donors underwrote the purchase. 2 years later, Reverend Stoll resigned for personal health reasons. In 1955, Reverend William Jacobs became the 18th minister of New England. He was born in Missouri in 1904 and was a graduate of Culver Stockton College in Missouri. Reverend Jacobs presided over a membership of 1,200 people. When the city of Aurora banned parking on Galena Boulevard, the church hired a policeman to direct the flow of cars. In the late 1950s, the church addressed the issue by acquiring properties to the west of the building for a parking lot. The church's Centennial year in 1958 celebrated new records in membership. 900 children and 80 teachers were involved in the Sunday school program. This photo shows a class taught by the minister's wife, Mabel Jacobs. The growth in membership prompted the church to undergo another construction project. An education wing was added in 1963. However, New England Church did not escape the changing attitudes toward religion that were being seen throughout the nation. Within 10 years, most of the rooms were unused. In 1961, the church voted to join the United Church of Christ. This new denomination was created in 1957 to merge the Congregational Christian churches, of which New England was a part, and the Evangelical Reformed Church. After 16 years of faithful service, Reverend Jacobs resigned in 1971, and Reverend Edward L. Coleman became pastor in 1972. During his term of service, attendance continued to decline as the religious landscape changed and people sought other interests on weekends. Coleman was minister of the church for only 2 years. Joe Dunham, professor of philosophy at Aurora College, served in the interim as pastor, while the church struggled to find a new minister. Professor Dunham returned to the church in 1992 as assistant minister, a position he holds to this day. By 1975, church membership had dropped to 660. In that year, Reverend L. Alexander Harper accepted the call to serve as minister. Reverend Harper was born in North Carolina and was a graduate of Yale Divinity School. He served as the minister of New England from 1975 until 1987, challenging the church to confront the social issues of the day. He also led the church in hosting programs for the wider community. The church's current motto was adopted during Reverend Harper's tenure: "A caring church for thinking people," captures the spirit of a welcoming congregation that embraces the intellect in its journey of faith. When Reverend Harper and his new associate minister, Reverend Gary L. McCann, joined forces in 1986, the tide began to turn. Harper retired in 1987, and McCann became senior minister in 1988. Reverend McCann was born in Michigan. He received his undergraduate degree and his Master of Divinity degree from Bethel University. He served as the senior minister of the First Baptist Church in Aurora from 1980 to 1986. He then joined New England Congregational Church. McCann's passion for addressing serious social issues and his encouragement of a solid music program brought a fresh perspective to the church. Membership began to increase, and the financial condition of the church improved. In 1990 and 1991, church members embarked on two large building projects. The chancel area was enlarged, and major renovations to the sanctuary walls and ceiling were completed. In 1994, air conditioning was added to the sanctuary, bringing the church into the 20th century. Then, in 2002, the church launched another building project. The Galena Boulevard entrance was updated to create a more inviting entranceway. The narthex was enlarged to facilitate fellowship, and a small kitchen was added beside it. Johnson Chapel, which had been located behind the narthex for many years, was relocated to the third floor behind the balcony. The original 1890 altar, pulpit, and lectern were moved to the new chapel. The total cost of the project was $1.8 million. The mortgage on the debt was burned during the church's sesquicentennial year of 2008. 15 years earlier, the congregation had purchased the house immediately adjacent to the church at 19 South Chestnut Street. It was given the name Chestnut House and has served as a place for junior and senior high youth to gather. It is interesting to note the role that the number 19 has played in the church's history. When the congregation chose the name of New England Congregational Church, it met at 19 South River Street. When the original church building was constructed, it was located at 19 South Locust Street. And when the church purchased a building for its youth, the address was 19 South Chestnut Street. There is nothing magical about the number 19. It merely lends an interesting footnote to a church history filled with tradition. Finally, a memorial garden was constructed on the east lawn between the church and Chestnut House. It is a beautiful, peaceful setting where church members can choose to have their remains buried. The story of New England Congregational Church is one of heartache and joy, failure and success. It is a story of a people of faith whose rich traditions reach back to the very founding of our country. And with the grace of God, this story will continue to evolve and inspire for generations to come.